Good morning, and thank you for joining us for MedCity Invest Precision Medicine. I'm Stephanie Baum, Director of Special Projects with MedCity News. Of all the projects I've worked on since I moved into this role, this conference really tops the list. This conference is the intersection of life sciences and health IT, from sharing medical data between institutions, applying AI to drug development targets, and providing new approaches to clinical trial recruitment, developing breakthrough cell and gene therapies, and critical companion diagnostics. It's a fascinating area, and over the next few days, you're going to hear speakers address these topics, and I hope you'll have questions for them. Before we kick things off with our first panel discussion on diagnostics, I'd like to give you some background on MedCity News. We were founded in late 2008 to cover innovation in healthcare and life sciences. We cover biopharma, digital health, medical devices, diagnostics, as well as hospitals and payers in the context of the industry's overall transformation. We host conferences in addition to precision medicine, focusing on investment, population health, digital health, and patient engagement. We accept outside content through our MedCity Influencers program. We also have a program called MedCitizens, geared towards startups under 6 years and under, with editorial and event benefits. If you have any questions about this, you can contact me at sbaum@MedCity News. We also have a podcast program called MedCity Pivot. You can access all our episodes on our website. And if you have any questions about this program, you can contact our editor-in-chief, Arundhati Parmar, at aparmar@MedCity News. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Independence Blue Cross, the leading health insurance organization in Southeastern Pennsylvania, and also a longtime sponsor of MedCity News events. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, JPOD at University of Pennsylvania. I'd also like to thank our partners, including the University City Science Center, Mid-America Healthcare Investors Network, Health Wildcatters, Startup Health, and Argo Pond Consulting. And now for our panel, what does the diagnostics landscape look like? Among the panelists are Dr. Peter Hulick, Medical Director with NorthShore University HealthSystem. Dr. Hulick is the medical director of the Mark R. Nieman Center for Personalized Medicine and division head of the Center for Medical Genetics at NorthShore University HealthSystem. Dr. Hulick also serves as clinical assistant professor in the Department of Human Genetics at the University of Chicago Pritzker School of Medicine. Previously, he served as an attending physician in medical genetics at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. Dr. Hulick earned his medical degree from Jefferson Medical College in 2001, right here in Philadelphia. He completed a residency in internal medicine at St. Luke's Hospital, Mayo Clinic, and completed a clinical fellowship in medical genetics at Harvard Medical School. He also earned a master's degree in medical science from Harvard Medical School in 2007. Another panelist is Nicole Lambert, President, Myriad Genetic Laboratories at Myriad Genetics. Since 2001, Mrs. Lambert has held progressively responsible senior leadership positions at Myriad Genetics, a leading precision medicine company dedicated to transforming patient lives worldwide with innovative molecular diagnostics. Prior to her current position, Nicole served as general manager for Myriad Oncology and Urology business units and vice president of dermatology. Before joining Myriad, she served as a genetic counselor at Houston Medical Center. Mrs. Lambert received her bachelor's degree in biology and sociology with a minor in women's health from Boston College and earned her master's in genetic counseling from Mount Sinai School of Medicine at New York University. We also have Scott Snyder, co-founder and CEO of Geneticure. Scott co-founded Geneticure in 2015 with the goal of using an individual's genetics to eliminate avoidable costs and outcomes from chronic diseases, beginning with hypertension. Prior to Geneticure, Scott spent 10 years in entrepreneurial roles, leading Target Corporation businesses in Minneapolis, most recently as director of a strategic advisory group for over 10 billion of consumer categories, including over-the-counter pharmacy. and our moderator, John Younger, MD, founding partner of Argo Consulting. John is a physician scientist by training with 20 years clinical experience in emergency medicine, critical care, and extracorporeal life support. He left academia in 2014 to spend the next 5 years as a full-time founder and chief scientific officer at Acadium Life Sciences Incorporated. Most recently, he led the incubation program and early stage investment portfolio at the University City Science Center in Philadelphia. Currently, he is the founding partner at Argo Consulting, a group that services early stage biotech companies and their investors, as well as universities seeking to understand the commercial potential of new interventions and new inventions and programs. John received his MD from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and an MS in statistical analysis and clinical trial design at the University of Michigan. Okay, and now, before we get started, I just want to remind our audience that if you have any questions for our panel, and I hope you do, you can drop your questions into the chat. And now I'll hand it over to you, John.
Great, Stephanie, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. We have an amazing panel, and we have a lot of things we could be talking about this morning. I have to say that even a year ago, sort of the prominence of diagnostic testing in the conversations, from everything from my kitchen table at night to my professional life, I've never seen anything like it. Diagnostic testing in the age of COVID is suddenly completely different. Folks are walking around talking about PCR, and it's really a remarkable time. And so it's really great to be thinking about precision medicine and about diagnostic testing, especially related to genetic testing this morning. And so I think I speak on behalf of everyone in the panel to say thank you for the invite, and let's get going. I'd like to start with Nicole. So, Myriad Genetics has been a prominent player in this conversation for a while. And I think, it has an enormous experience in sort of understanding, not just the potential of precision medicine diagnostic testing, but also sort of all the nooks and crannies that come along with that. And so, Nicole, if we could start with you, tell me, sort of in the span of your career to date, how has this evolved from when you started as a genetic counselor to now? It's remarkable, but tell us a little bit about the trajectory of the field.
Sure, absolutely. I think so many things have changed over the years. I started out as a genetic counselor in Houston about 25 years ago, and everything has changed. But the two main things that I would highlight, I think, is just sort of the criteria for testing, or who has, access or meets guidelines for testing. When I started out, we were looking for families where there were 4 affected people in the family. You had to have, 4 relatives with breast cancer or ovarian cancer in order to meet the criteria for testing. Whereas now, the American Society of Breast Surgeons says that every woman with a history of breast cancer is eligible for genetic testing, regardless of their family history. And so the criteria has changed quite a bit. The other thing that I would highlight is just our ability to get much more precise with how we estimate risk for breast cancer or risk for second cancers. It used to be in the early days, we only tested for 2 genes, for BRCA1 and 2. And if you were positive for those genes, we would say you have up to an 87% lifetime risk to develop breast cancer. Well, that's a really wide range, right? We don't know exactly what that number is. Now, with the invention of risk score and some enhancements to genetic testing, we can be super precise about a woman's risk to develop breast cancer. We can pinpoint that to exactly 35% or 56%, or whatever that number exactly is for you. The other thing that we can do is in the early days, I got a lot of questions from patients about, okay, I have up to 87% lifetime risk to develop breast cancer, but when is this something I need to act on in the next 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? A lot of women that undergo genetic testing are, young professionals or young women with families, and they're saying, I just don't have time right now to do a prophylactic mastectomy. I think I might want to do that, but do I have to do that now? And with the latest advancements, we're able to give patients a lifetime risk, but also a 5-year risk. So we can tell women, your lifetime risk might be 56% to develop breast cancer, but your 5-year risk is only 3%, right? Those are really different numbers, and it really empowers patients to make decisions, not only about what they want to do to manage their risk, but when.
That's fantastic. Yeah, thank you very much for that. So Scott, I want to follow up a little bit about what Nicole said. So certainly oncology was at the vanguard, from very early on. I guess there were Mendelian diseases are somewhat different, but in terms of, risk stratification, oncology was it. And I think that, there's been a move, progressively towards more population health driven initiatives, partly because, the cost of the data has continued to really fall, and sort of population conversations now, and not just conversations with people with strong family histories, those conversations are kind of practical at this point. So from your perspective, from Geneticure's perspective, tell me about how you move from sort of easily digestible ideas about, BRCA1 and 2, sort of a really discrete, this is a risk, to what Geneticure is working on, which is sort of this, sort of blended sense of, looking at a variety of parameters at one time genetically and understanding a patient's risk and how best to tune therapy. How has that, the ability to do multi-gene panels, how has that changed how Geneticure is thinking about hypertension?
Yeah, thanks, John. It's really a little bit by chance, based on the strengths of our team. Particularly, my co-founder is my brother, Eric Snyder, who's a physiologist. And our other co-founder, Ryan, is a molecular geneticist. And they were collaborating in the research world and looking at this longstanding promise of using a multi-gene panel to guide towards drug selection. And we began to look at various places to start and thinking about bringing in multiple experts to take, more of a shotgun approach, take one test and have it be actionable for multiple diseases. But when we looked at the opportunity in the landscape, like you mentioned within population health, it became really clear that hypertension was a big red flag. And for a number of reasons, it became appealing. There's a well-documented bell curve response to therapy in hypertension. So what may work for you may cause my blood pressure to go up. It's very poorly controlled. With new guidelines, about half the country's adults are considered hypertensive, and only 24% of them have it under control. It's very heritable. So more likely, if you have parents with hypertension, you're more likely to develop it as well. And all of these medications are not necessarily completely safe. They all have side effects. But really, based on Eric's strength in nephrology and hypertension, our fourth co-founder, Tom Olson, in cardiology at Mayo Clinic, we began to just go an inch wide, mile deep into this disease. And from my perspective, I came from the consumer health world. Looking at the patient experience in hypertension, it leaves a lot to be desired. So the traditional standard of care is to start on monotherapy. If there's not success in reaching goal, often a second medication is added, sometimes a third medication, regardless really of efficacy of those first two therapies. And every time you add a medication to the patient's regimen, therapy non-adherence goes up by roughly 70%. So all of this kind of builds into this really poorly controlled disease with a really poor experience. And that's why it's the leading preventable cause of death in the world. And so we really started with a different approach where we thought, if we go inch wide, mile deep into hypertension and really binge on hypertension, as some have said, we can focus on a pharmacogenomic panel that's a little bit unique, where we're looking beyond the way medications are metabolized, which has shown to be on its own pretty meaningless for a complex disease rooted in integrated physiology, deeper into what are the functional drug targets that make those organ systems do what they do. So that's kind of how we built the first pharmacogenomics panel with hypertension. And we've since kind of expanded on that approach to looking at also the ways that these variants in unique variants, some overlap, but other unique variants in hypertension can lead to variability in response in certain device therapies as well.
Great, thank you very much. And again, I would encourage anyone with questions to go ahead and put them in chat. We'll try to address them in real time as they come up. So Peter, you are the reality check on what actually can happen. So I know at NorthShore, as we discussed earlier, you rolled out the DNA 10K initiative. You started really, a program to do sort of population genetics in your clinical practice at NorthShore. And I think that's going to be increasingly common. So talk to me a little bit about what you see happening. So, when I started, this would have been a PCR, and you would have looked for the band to move on a gel. And now it's like a standard order set, right? You just click go, and the patient has the assessments done. Tell me about at NorthShore, sort of, how the technology is penetrating up till now. And I think sort of in a, and not in a field specific, but just sort of across care. How is it penetrating your practice, and what's going to come next? How is this going to become ubiquitous?
Sure. So you hit a really key point there. To really capture the benefits of genomics, we have to improve access. We have a relatively large division relative to our health system. We can't see every patient who possibly would benefit from genetic testing. And there's been a lot of effort on targeted therapies for advanced disease, and that's incredibly important. I don't want to dismiss that. But we also need to think about, well, how do we actually prevent disease to begin with? Our genetics may be very insightful for that, but only if we also bring it into the context of other important health parameters. And so we really started to double down on how do we get this to our primary care physicians and our primary care network, recognizing that at best, in an annual history and physical, a physician might have 30 seconds to manage this. So how do you tackle that implementation challenge? And also battling the educational barriers on patient and clinician side on what their knowledge is of genetics, especially in a rapidly evolving field. So in essence, we had to create the easy button solution in terms of, in the moment alerts or messages, utilizing tools in our electronic medical record, utilizing clinical decision support tools for pharmacogenomics. So we didn't have to rely on our primary care physicians being experts per se, but we had to be able to steer them in the moment in the right direction. And a lot of this is also with patient engagement tool, with deploying electronically based questionnaires in advance of an annual history and physical through MyChart, which is, we're on Epic. That's their patient portal app. We call it NorthShore Connect, where we get clinical decision support, branching logic questionnaires on some targeted key questions that might signal the need for genetic testing, video education for patients on gene and other important issues, and the ability to consent in advance of their appointment for a population-based panel that then the primary care physician can order on their behalf after seeing a best practice alert when they come in. Not going to solve the world with best practice alerts, but our goal has been to move the needle and try to keep making advances and chip away at this access issue and overcome the esotericness of genetics.
So to follow up on that a little bit, how do you see moving, what this initiative is doing in your health system from a, kind of a nice to have to a must have, yeah. Right? So I think, having built plenty of BPAs myself in the Epic platform, you can push all sorts of stuff out. But how do you make the pull? How do you get this primary care provider say, I don't want to close out this patient encounter until I understand a little bit more about the genetic background in which I'm having this conversation? How does that happen?
Well, it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg. It's show me the data, but in order to get the data, you have to have some buy-in to be part of this initiative. But I think we're starting to see that benefit and closing a loop within our health system, because now we have about over 1,000 patients through this primary care effort who have had real results that they've acted on medically. We've had some early cancer detected for families that probably would have gone unrecognized at least for a few years in our system. And every one of our physicians who participated in DNA 10K, which was 99%, which that's just amazing that we get primary care physicians ordering genetic testing, period. They on average have about 3 or 4 patients, if you exclude pharmacogenomics, because that's a different ball of wax in terms of results, that have a patient in their panel where this has affected what their screening or guideline management should be. And these are genes that, you know, have NCCN guidelines or American Heart Association policy statements on what we should do in terms of not only the patient, but the family. And I think that's an important concept as you think about reach and extending this knowledge. In genetics, the patient is really the entire family.
Great. So to follow on with that, I'm gonna just run right with a question that came on the chat line, and this is for Scott. And so I think that this kind of amplifies what Peter was just talking about in terms of you know, how do you drive therapy when a lot of these findings are still, you know, they're, you know, kind of, you know, marginal, you know, benefits. They're difficult to, you know, prove in a small, you know, sort of patient practice. But you know, from Geneticure's perspective, maybe you can sort of walk through, maybe just walk through a case where you said, here, you know, here's something that was done, you know, the panel was sent, and here's how it was different after the data came back. So give me sort of like a great use case for how Geneticure's panel for hypertension impacted somebody.
Yeah, we've got, I mean, quite a few really exciting ones that keep us going, you know, that keep our mission on fire. But you know, we've had patients that have tried medications for 10, 15 years and not found the right mix of solutions. And we've genotyped them and got them under control immediately. But, you know, I think the root of the question gets at, you know, how does this actually work? And what the Geneticure panel does is basically it examines very specific variants related to receptor targets within organ systems, plus a really deep appreciation for how these organ systems are prioritized based on the unique profile of variants within each individual. So rather than using kind of a single gene predicting the response to blood pressure pharmacotherapy, we use a mathematical system to weight multiple genotypes against each other and against organ systems. And this wasn't, you know, something that we put together and started commercializing. We are very much an evidence-first organization. So the first several years of our existence were spent heads down in various clinical trials. We started with a small retrospective trial with a set of SNPs, and then we knocked out some SNPs. We added more SNPs looking at their functionality on their own. And then we adjust weighting on the new panel, study that again in a new clinical trial, and so on. And each of these SNPs are well studied based on how functional they are for blood pressure response. So a good example of this is, you know, the prediction of vascular response. We have renin, which converts to angiotensin 1, which is converted to angiotensin 2, and that product causes high blood pressure in some individuals via ACE. So then the algorithm will look at if a patient has a functional genotype for renin and therefore is more likely to have higher plasma renin levels, a functional genotype for angiotensin, and is there more likely to have higher plasma angiotensin levels, and high functioning ACE and angiotensin 2 receptor genotype, they will likely respond to an ACE inhibitor or an angiotensin 2 receptor blocker or an ARB. So these things kind of are meant to give an insight into the basics of the algorithm, but it's a really complex and well-studied approach.
Great, thank you. So Nicole, from Myriad's perspective, so what Peter's describing at NorthShore is, you know, a laboratory developed test is not exactly what this is, but this is, you know, this is a panel that they've sort of sat down and said, these are the things we want to sort of measure. From Myriad's perspective, in terms of their own product pipeline, in terms of how you position, you know, Myriad technology into a health system, if the health system is capable of sort of saying, we're going to grab some of this, we're going to grab some of that, and kind of building out their panels sort of, you know, in a very unique way, how does Myriad sort of operate when sort of diagnostic testing and certain, you know, a particular SNP, when that becomes so democratized in terms of how it's ordered? How do you strategically sort of place Myriad's, you know, all of their products and their services? How do you place that when teams in a particular clinical entity can just sort of stand up their own panels of testing?
Well, I think we've always been, tried to be really good partners with systems, like what Peter's describing, right? In terms of not just offering the best accuracy and clinical grade testing that you can find on the market, but also, trying to support them in their goal and their vision of making testing easy to use, right? So, what we want to do is partner with those systems to say, how can we make this easy for you? How can we make it so easy that you don't need to do, testing with multiple different labs or with, testing in-house versus the interpretation that you might get from Myriad. So we're really looking at, as I said, not just the test itself, but what else can we do to help customers like Peter establish their mission across the system, right? When I started in this field, genetic testing was only offered at large academic centers, right? So I remember talking to a medical oncologist in El Paso, Texas, that when we talked about how do you offer genetic testing to your patients, he said, well, I refer them to MD Anderson. Well, that's a 10-hour drive, right? Like that's not making this testing accessible. And so we've put a lot of time and effort into, how do clinicians easily identify patients that are appropriate for testing? How do they get them tested in their office? How do we make the reports simple and easy to use and easy for clinicians to understand and easy for them to explain to patients? And I think if you can bring those, kind of clinical, financial, and operational goals all together and partner with large systems and community providers, we can all achieve our goals.
Yeah, and John, I want to jump in there. Dovetail on what Nicole said. Our DNA 10K was actually a partnership with an external lab with Color Genomics. So we are doing a hybrid of things internally based on next-gen sequencing. We've decided as an organization for now, and this is always a conversation in development of, focusing on somatic testing in-house because there's often a quicker need to do smaller samples and faster turnaround, and we can control that a little bit better. But a lot of times too, it's a scalability issue. It's one thing to generate the NGS data that says an A is an A, a T is a T, but the interpretation, the bioinformatics, that is something that is critically important to get reliable results. And that's where, unique partnerships are immensely valuable for variant reclassification and follow-up. Without that, we couldn't do this, and it would be, certainly not in the interest of our patients to do this as well. And that's a critical piece to this continuum of care.
I agree completely. I mean, at Myriad, we've tested over 5 million patients. So, we have a large database to help interpret those variants and to help return that information back to the clinicians. Whereas large systems like Peter's, they have the ability to reach multiple patient populations. So they're very, mutually compatible goals.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So the overall theme of this conference this week, in large part is talking about investment, and none of us per se are investors, but all of us, come up close to that type of question. And I wanted to sort of talk to each of you a little bit about this. So, Nicole at Myriad, you do pursue strategic partnerships. You're looking for new ideas, for new technologies, for new teams to sort of engage. Scott, you are out, in the mix, trying to differentiate what you're developing compared to what other folks are. And Peter, I'm sure you're being approached with routine frequency to either, just straight out adopt or at least to evaluate a new technology from a new team. So starting with Nicole, then to Scott, and then to Peter, tell me a little bit about how you sort of size up an opportunity from a partnership perspective. What does it need to do to stand out from the crowd? And then I think, Scott, when you're looking for partners, sort of the flip side of that, what do you look for in terms of a partner that can help, move you forward? So I guess, Nicole, we'll start with you. Tell me about how you evaluate new ideas.
Sure. I think a couple of things for us is, is this an opportunity to provide the best quality care to patients, right? That's really number one for us. And then, and are we uniquely positioned? Are we best positioned to help this partner? And then I think, the second question is really, are we the best partner for the person that we're thinking of, right? A lot of our strengths come from our size, right? And our ability to commercialize new tests, to educate physicians, to bring new tests to a large market. So for us, I think, we started with partnerships such as, AstraZeneca, honestly. They, as many people know, they had this class of drugs, this PARP inhibitors, that actually, when they looked across a large population of cancer patients, that drug failed in some early clinical trials and was in danger of being shelved completely. And, we realized that we were uniquely positioned to maybe do a subset analysis of some of their clinical trial cohorts to pull out the patients that we think would benefit from the drugs. And actually, we were able to do that. We were able to identify those patients that were, had BRCA deficiencies, and those patients benefited tremendously from PARP inhibitors. And so that sort of rescued that class of drugs. And now those drugs are available to, millions of patients worldwide for ovarian cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer, pancreatic cancer. So, we felt like we had an opportunity to improve clinical care, and that we were uniquely positioned to do that, and that we were uniquely positioned to, partner with medical oncologists and with AstraZeneca to bring those tests to market, to ensure that patients got the correct companion diagnostic and that they got the drug that would benefit them most. So I would say that's a good example of how we look at things. We also look at, as I talked about earlier, process things. Are there things that we could do, or there partnerships that we could have that would make life easier for our physician customers or for our patients, right? So we look at partnerships with, EMR companies or chatbot companies, or, some of these companies that are really doing things that are innovative and that are in the point of care, that will position our test to be the easiest possible option for our customers.
Thanks. So Scott, on the flip side, you are setting up a meeting with a potential partner, someone that's been in the business potentially longer, may have market share that you're interested in engaging. How do you and the team at Geneticure sort of size up, a potential partner? What is it that you're looking for when you're engaging a more long-standing corporate partner?
Sure. Yeah. So. We're an early stage company, so we're, like Nicole said, trying to help as many people as quickly as possible with our technology, and we firmly believe that this technology has the ability to save millions of lives. So we, by nature of our organization, made a really strong commitment to evidence first. We have a very strong scientific team, leaders in their field, but we're not lab developed test commercial experts, and so what we've done is trying to adopted kind of a lean startup model where we've used a third-party reference lab to do our genotyping, our wet lab work. That allows us to focus scientifically, and then we focus on commercial partners that meet certain criteria. So others that believe in evidence, as being kind of a meaningful barrier to adoption. When it comes to health systems and customers, for example, we're focused kind of there's a when you're trying to change the way things are done, like we are with this disease, there's a slow adoption curve. Hypertension has been treated generally the same way for quite some time, and so you have an early adopter pool of thought leaders, at centers of excellence, concierge medical practices, ACOs, and then you move into the payer provider world, and then kind of general healthcare systems that are at various stages focused on pushing out, right? So you have established primary care physicians that have been doing things the same way for 30 years that may not be ready yet for the technology, but you have others that are frustrated with status quo and see the struggles that their patients go through and are early on. And some of those are at partners of ours at hypertension centers of excellence, at academic universities and so on. You mentioned investors, and this is I guess an investor conference. We kind of look for similar themes. So Mayo Clinic is an investor of ours, and they're a strong supporter of what we do. They believe in the mission. Then we have a large health system as an investor that again is kind of willing and ready to push out on the way things have been done. But we're also focused on large payer provider organizations and so on as investor partners and strategics as well, and also those that appreciate the kind of impact nature of this type of technology. So there's a huge underserved aspect to access to care and hypertension, and really strong disparities in outcomes socioeconomically in certain groups that we think we can help solve. So we have a lot of our partner themes are around impact ability as well.
Great. So Peter, along the same vein, so what is it that you look for when you're approached by a startup, or even something that may not even be a startup yet, when a couple of grad students show up on your door and say, we have a thing? What is it that you have to do to roll out? I mean, your providers probably only have finite patience for seeing yet another new thing put in front of them. So for a startup that's going to approach you as a sophisticated user of these data, what do you want to see to sort of be comfortable, to sort of be excited that this is something that you can sort of put into the production environment, as it were?
Right. Yeah, we become known for our reputation for being able to implement. So we certainly get approached by a variety of different organizations on how could we partner and work together. First and foremost, what's potential impact on patients? I mean, that's core to our mission. I mean, we're a hospital system. We're here to take care of our community and the patient care. So where is it on the maturity of that scale? Then what problem is it trying to solve for? And is that a problem NorthShore really has? Because it's very easy to get distracted chasing after different things. And while we are blessed that we have resources to do a lot of innovative things, they are finite, and we have to be conscious of making an intentional choice that we're solving a problem that's going to help in the long run, or even short run, for patients of our care. And there's a spectrum of range, because we obviously want to do things with immediate impact, but we also want to have a mind to the future. And part of that has been alluded to with things like polygenic risk scores, et cetera, because when you think about it, most people aren't going to have a traditional Mendelian genetic variant that's going to change their care. We certainly have to identify those, and that's the building block for the knowledge base, getting comfort in the space. But in theory, everyone has a polygenic risk score that can help them risk stratify either higher or lower. How do we start to capitalize that and really reach the potential of population genomics, where you are certainly increasing screening or interventions where appropriate, but hopefully someday we can start to back off as well and really get the right mix of care for a patient, because too much care can do just as much harm as undercare.
Yeah. So let's move that idea forward a little bit. So a new company comes to you, and they have a minimal viable product of a testing regime. They have a plan. They can do it, and they want to try to implement it. Many times, what comes next is the phone rings and there's an investor looking for a diligence call, and they want to know, well, what do you think about that? So what, as someone who I'm sure picks up the phone for that conversation pretty often, what do you think investors need to be asking of beta sites, right? Of these people that have the first sort of contact? What should they be looking for maybe in selecting them? But what is it that you want investors to make sure they walk away with when they're sort of exploring what your experience was with one of these new ideas?
I think with any new concept, there's a learning curve for the institution. And so there needs to be a commitment to iterations and learning. So we pride ourselves on being able to implement, but pivot when necessary. I mean, we have a little bit of a mantra internally that, we sort of source the parts as we build the plane as we fly, because no one has really done this to the extent that we have. So how do you close that loop, have that feedback, and ensure that, okay, if you're seeing a signal that things are working in a way that you intentionally didn't mean to, you can catch that signal and pivot back. And as far as scale, a lot just part of it just depends on where the maturity of the data is, whatever product or idea we're talking about. We have some things that we do smaller pilots to see, can we operationally scale this? We did that with before our DNA 10K. We didn't just decide to do population health for 10,000 patients. We were approached with, we had a concept, we piloted it, we're very good at implementing. We had some tests, primary care sites. And when we realized we could achieve that goal, we had clear gating mechanisms of, well, how do we expand? And I think that's the key. What are the benchmarks to say, okay, we hit this, that means we go to this level and we can continue to grow and implement further.
Great. So I'm going to try to hit some of the questions in the chat room. So Scott, we're going to come to you first. So there's a question that specifically relates to hypertension, and I think what they're asking is data modeling based not necessarily on genome, but on wearable technology, that the very broad stream of data that's coming from a given patient. Were they in the car today? Did they go upstairs today? So tell me about how you see, you could look at that data and say it's very complementary to the genome. You could also look at that data and say that it's telling you stuff that the genome would tell you. Maybe you don't even need the genome. Tell me about the, it's the sort of the depth of data that comes from a particular patient about their life on Earth, about how that data sort of is complemented by what you're trying to do. Is a very high resolution wearable data going to sort of take away some of the information that you would otherwise provide? What is it? How do you connect your modeling with the modeling that's coming from the device side?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer is that's not really where we're focused. We don't believe that lifestyle modeling will ever replace genetic data when it comes to guiding drug selection. However, I think maybe Peter said it, or maybe Nicole, that the patient family history was kind of the precursor to pharmacogenomics. And so data regarding heritability is highly valuable, but we think we can obviously move farther past that. Where I do see, wearables and kind of this overabundance of data really helping is around blood pressure monitoring. Of course, there's a lot of really exciting advances in blood pressure modeling, and that's really critical to understand if when measured outside of the office, we're getting consistent readings versus at point of care, because of course you have well-documented white coat syndrome and things like that. So in terms of did the drug work, those types of tools will provide a lot of value. But in terms of will I develop hypertension because my Fitbit said something, I don't necessarily think that to be the case, because a lot of these, and that's not really what we're looking at, is looking at genetics in terms of disease susceptibility. We're a post-diagnostic genetic test, so we're more concerned about guiding the right therapy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will jump in though. I think we have to keep in mind there is an interplay with genetics and environment, and so anything we can do to activate patients to lead healthier lives. You look at the coronary artery disease polygenic risk scores. They showed even when at the highest decile that you could modify that risk with activity. So how do we activate patients around this and use it as a motivator to improve their care? We can't just look at genomics. We can't just look at environmental things. It has to be an intersection. We're great at producing data, but how do we distill it down to that? Again, primary care physician has 30 seconds to act on this. What should we tell them to do? And that's the holy grail, if you will.
I agree completely, Peter. When we looked at something like prostate cancer, we did a lot of research on the genetics, but we also looked at what are the other normal ClinPath features that urologists are looking at to take care of these patients. And we were able to put all of these different factors through a statistical model and understand that really the genomic score and really two clinical parameters were actually the most predictive of risk. And so we were able to put those in a weighted algorithm and give that back to the physician so that the physician doesn't have to think about, well, genetics is telling me this, the pathology tells me this, the PSA is this, there's all these different factors that the physicians have to figure out how to put together in their mind. And the power of looking at all these different factors is giving physicians back a combined clinical risk score that does that weighting and those, trade-offs for them.
Yeah, and John, to your point, when you say, what do I look for, as a health system for someone who's coming with a novel idea, it may not actually be something that we actually give or offer to a patient. It may be something, a tool or a way to look at this data or aggregate this data or have better insight into how we use it and distill it into a more meaningful, digestible parameter for a physician or a health team to track, or even the patient themselves potentially.
Great. So, maybe for all of you, maybe we start with Nicole. So it seems that we're not going to be long before we're sort of in the post-sequence world where it's just sort of a given that the sequence data for a patient exists, right? It's just like the cost is going to come down enough. My dog's partly sequenced at this point, right? So what's the model for all these businesses, going out, and it may be 5 years, where in 5 years it's just assumed that you either have your exomes done or some variant of that, and that the sequence data is already present, and that the value add at that point becomes, it becomes all interpretation, right? It becomes all algorithm. Is that where this is heading? I don't know if that's the promised land.
Yeah.
That may be the next land.
I think it is. Yeah, I think it is. I think the promise is to pull this information earlier in the care continuum so that you don't have to go through trial and error. And we're starting to see that across multiple specialties, right? So if you look at something like I described with PARP inhibitors, the medical oncologist doesn't have to, okay, this is first line therapy, and then when it fails, we're going to try second line therapy. You can do a genetic test up front and realize, okay, a PARP inhibitor is going to work for this patient. We see it in mental health, right, where depression was treated in that way. It's a trial and error. Okay, you're depressed. Let's try Lexapro and see if that works, and then we'll try something else, right? Whereas now we're seeing with pharmacogenomics in our mental health business, let's do the genetic test up front. Let's figure out which antidepressant is going to work for you, and let's prescribe it immediately. Let's not go through years of trial and error, right? And so I think you're starting to see that across multiple specialties now, that we don't have to wait and see. We can know immediately and provide really on target, on time care to patients with much better outcomes.
Yeah, and we've been building to that, honestly, for the last 5 years. We have an internal bioinformatics team, small but very talented. We have our in-house solution. So we didn't find a solution externally. We built a software called Flype that really has been our Swiss Army knife bioinformatics tools. It's allowed us to ingest our internal NGS data, for example, on our pharmacogenomics panel or our somatic panel, run frequency, allele frequency data to make sure for quality control in our pharmacogenomics. It helps facilitate automation of our pharmacogenomics reports. It ingests data from our DNA 10K initiative, where we're getting discrete results back from color. It interfaces with ACTX, which we have partnered with for some of our clinical decision support work in the pharmacogenomics world. So it really is kind of our clearinghouse, because everything right now can't be put in the EMR. It'd be too much. So how do we get different elements into the EMR at the right time? And to your point, we're expecting, and we already have this happening, people will have genomic information coming from a variety of sources. There needs to be a clearinghouse. And when something is clinically relevant, that it's ready to be pushed to the EMR to have clinical actionability behind it, and we are comfortable with the clinical utility and validity, it's there. We're ready. It's literally a flip of the button. Prime case example, we're using genomic indicator function in Epic, where because we have this data discretely, we know, and we're getting better at tracking who has a BRCA mutation in our health system. That sounds like a very simple question. That's very hard for any health system to answer accurately. Yet when a new guideline comes out, the latest is, how aggressive prostate cancer is associated with BRCA2, or screening guidelines that just got changed after Labor Day for pancreatic cancer screening with BRCA and family history structure. How do you push that information out structurally, systematically? This allows us to, because the first step is just organizing the data in a usable way.
As an aside, is NorthShore including these activities in their marketing materials yet? Is this on a billboard somewhere?
Yeah, we have this broader concept called advanced primary care, and it started as entering the genomics piece, but it's really starting to look at, well, how do you bring all elements, into the care of a patient. And for a long time, unfortunately, primary care, we weren't doing a good job with the genomics piece. And so we're trying to infuse that and now bring it into the context of other things that one should be doing, whether it's making sure someone has access to the screening centers because they don't live too far, or digital access for follow-up, et cetera, and different touch points in our system.
Very good. So Scott, sort of same question. When everyone is sequenced, how does Geneticure stand out from everybody that can write a couple lines of code and do an AI algorithm on some SNPs? What's the key to being out in front?
Well, this is a really interesting topic, and we've looked at. It's important to differentiate between what is now being called whole genome sequencing, which is really an exome plus sequence that doesn't cover a lot of our variants. So we've had the same hope that and talked to partners that are pursuing genome on file and will ping the sections of the database for when we need it. But none have been able to fully cover our panel in a way that we felt was clinically responsible. We've got really unique locations as upstream sites or intronic indels that just aren't what other people are looking at. And that goes back to what makes us really different. We're not looking at the same drug metabolizing enzyme panel that most health systems are looking at or labs. We're very narrowly focused on these sites that are important in the drug response for hypertension. It's just our unique approach. And the other barrier to this too, which may be overcome, is that the panel has to make sense from a health economic standpoint to payers. And so you can't until whole genome sequencing is, and it's plummeting in cost. But until a panel like ours is so cheap that you can proactively put it in everyone's chart, payers aren't going to cover it. And so that's why, kind of our approach is a little bit different, where we try to be actionable at point of care post-diagnosis versus kind of proactive. If you develop a disease, here's what may be an actionable solution. So it's just a little bit of a unique approach.
Mm-hmm. So I guess it's finally time to tip our hat to reimbursement. We had to get here sooner or later to talk about this a little bit. My wife actually developed the inherited cardiomyopathy program at Michigan and had a lot of experience in working with providers and showing that a genotype was actually a faster path to screening families than the other diagnostic tests that were available. So for each of you, and maybe starting with Peter, what's the real value proposition? How are we going to continue to sort of demonstrate that this is effort well spent? Is it going to be disease by disease? We're going to do it for pancreatic cancer. We'll do it for breast cancer. We'll do it for GI malignancies. Otherwise, is it one at a time, Peter, that we're going to do this, or how is the sort of the conversation with payers going to change? Where there's just sort of a given that these measurements are worth reimbursing?
Yeah, I think that's an ongoing question in terms of it continues to evolve. I think there has to be a disease centric because there's just too many genes to go one by one. Although you start to have some of that work done with ClinGen, which is an NIH effort that goes through a rigorous effort to validate that a gene is associated with a particular disease or condition. And so that's a great starting point. And then you start to build the evidence of, well, what's the threshold of risk that we have in intervention that is meaningful? And that's different by disease, by disease. So for example, breast cancer is generally accepted by most organizations that when a lifetime risk for a woman is greater than 20%, keep in mind, average risk is about 12%. We should do something different, okay? And usually that means enhancing screening, which is adding breast MRIs, staggered with mammograms. At what age? That gets to Nicole's comments earlier. It depends then on the details of what risk factor or what's driving the risk. Is it a Mendelian gene? Or are we talking a polygenic risk score, and how much data that we have there to stratify the age at which we do it? So some of this will have to be a little bit of a public health initiative of what level of risk is acceptable for us to tolerate as a society, and when should we intervene to provide enhanced care? And every country handles that differently, and that's a challenge.
Very good. Scott, what do you think? in terms of reimbursement, in terms of making your case?
Yeah, we've been payer focused and working backwards from there since day one, because, again, in an investor conference, the first question is, this sounds really neat. Who's going to pay for it and why? So we build clinical trials to both get clinical outcome improvements, but those drive health economic outcome improvements. For example, our largest study demonstrated that patients who were on a medication as Geneticure would have recommended as first choice had a 36% lower blood pressure than standard of care. That then drives a significant risk reduction in serious adverse events, which are the cost drivers of hypertension. So kind of put in a different framework against, say, GeneSight mental health, where you have expensive medications. Our value proposition is not in saving costs on medications. In fact, in our health economic model, over life, patients are on more medications, but they're generics. They're on more medications because we've shifted the population mix from hypertensive uncontrolled to hypertensive controlled. The real savings comes in stroke, heart attack, cardiovascular disease risk reduction, which is directly correlated to that reduction in blood pressure that I mentioned. And this has been really well build on that. And then we price based on what generates a really compelling ROI to a payer inside of a short window. So we're focused on direct medical expenses inside of 3 years, knowing that patients have plan churn. And that's how we build our case to payers and keep growing that evidence as we do new trials going forward.
Very good. So Nicole, we started with you and we're going to let you hit it out of the park. So talk to us
Sure.
about Myriad's thinking about reimbursement strategies going forward, and then we'll call it a day.
Sure, absolutely. Very similar to what the other panelists have said. I think you have to continuously prove the cost effectiveness and the value proposition to payers for what you're doing. I mean, I think the payers are in a very difficult spot because with the explosion of technology, they're being asked to evaluate new technologies and new genetic tests, hundreds by the day. And it's very difficult for them to separate out what's going to provide true value to them and what's not. So we definitely have put a lot of effort and energy into cost effectiveness, and to looking not only at is ordering the test cost effective, but what will patients do with the test results, right? Because a fear of a payer is this is going to lead to all sorts of downstream medical interventions that may or may not be medically necessary and will be very costly to the system. So, we recently completed a study that looked at the difference in costs if a patient gets just single syndrome, BRCA 1 and 2 testing versus if they get a more comprehensive panel. The other thing that we're really looking at is sort of value-based agreements with payers to say, we did an agreement with Tufts Healthcare actually up in New England to look at our prostate cancer test to say, we think we can better risk stratify these patients, put more patients on active surveillance safely that need to be on active surveillance and help you manage that population better. And we'll put skin in the game with you as well to see what those patient outcomes are. So it's an opportunity to, I think, get creative and innovate and partner with payers to get the best value and the best outcomes for patients.
Great. Well, with that, we will wrap it up. So to all the panelists, thank you so much. It's pretty clear your expertise is essentially bottomless in this area. We could go for a long time before we got to an I don't know, but it's been really great to hear everyone think about it. I want to thank MedCity for the invitation to do this panel to get the meeting kicked off. Stephanie, with that, we're going to hand it back to you.
Thank you so much to our speakers and our audience. We look forward to seeing you at the next MedCity Invest Precision Medicine session.